Under the heavy rain, a boy stood before the grand doors of the Maxwell estate, his bright blue eyes piercing through the darkness. When the door swung open, Eleanor Maxwell froze. The boy looked exactly like her son, the one who had vanished without a trace 7 years ago. "Don't you recognize me, Mom?" Her heart clenched. Was this a miracle, a cruel trick, or the revelation of a horrifying truth? Stay with us until the end to uncover the shocking secret. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you never miss another thrilling story. Eleanor Maxwell stood frozen at the door, her breath caught in her throat. The storm raged behind the boy, lightning flashing for a brief moment, illuminating his pale face. His blonde hair was soaked, clinging to his forehead, his clothes drenched with rain, but none of that mattered. What made Eleanor's heart clench was the face she knew too well. He looked exactly like her son, Oliver, the child who had vanished without a trace 7 years ago. Her fingers tightened around the doorframe, her legs trembling as if the weight of the past had just crashed down on her. Her mind refused to accept what she was seeing, but then the boy spoke, and his voice sliced through her disbelief like a cold blade. "Don't you recognize me, Mom?" A tear slipped down Eleanor's cheek before she even realized she was crying. Her hands trembled as she reached forward, hesitating just inches from the boy's face. It couldn't be. She had searched for him in despair for years, spent sleepless nights staring at old photographs, recalling his laughter, the way his small hand fit into hers. She had buried hope, forced herself to accept reality. And now her son stood before her, alive. The boy didn't move, his blue eyes locked onto hers unwavering. But there was something in his gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. This was Oliver, his face, his voice. But something was different, something she couldn't place. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak. "Oliver?" The boy smiled faintly. "It's me." She pulled him inside, shutting the door firmly behind them. The storm outside howled as if the universe itself wanted to warn her about the impossibility unfolding in her home. She led him to the living room, her heart hammering so hard she thought she might faint. "Where have you been?" Her voice wavered, nearly drowned out by the rain pounding against the windows. The boy sat down on the couch, his fingers tracing the seams of the fabric. "That's a long story." Eleanor dropped to her knees in front of him, her hands cupping his face. Even though he had grown, the features remained the same. The high cheekbones, the tiny dimple on his chin, the faint scar on his eyebrow from when he fell off his bike as a child. "I thought you were dead," her voice broke. "I know." She stared at him, waiting for him to cry, to explain everything, to beg for her protection. But there was no panic in his face, no desperation she had expected to see. The joy of reunion slowly gave way to an unsettling feeling, creeping into the depths of her mind. "You have to tell me what happened. Where have you been all these years? How did you get back?" The boy tilted his head slightly, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't remember much, just fragments. A dark place. And then I woke up in the woods, not far from here." Eleanor sucked in a sharp breath. "Someone took you, didn't they?" He hesitated. "I think so." She shot to her feet, pacing the room in distress. "We have to call the police. We have to tell them you're back. They never stop looking for you." "Number." His voice was cold, stopping Eleanor in her tracks. He was staring at her, his expression unreadable. "Not yet. Please, just tonight. No police." She had waited for this moment for 7 years. The police had let her down, turned Oliver's disappearance into a forgotten case file. But now she could touch him, see him, know he was safe. Could she risk losing him again? She knelt before him, gripping his hands. "Why?" His fingers curled slightly around hers. "Because if they know I'm back, the people who took me will come looking for me." The air in the room grew heavy. Eleanor's heart pounded, her breath unsteady. The thought of losing him again was unbearable. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, just tonight." Oliver smiled, but there was something about his smile that unsettled her. It was small, vague, almost like a smile of someone who already knew what was coming. A sudden knock at the door echoed through the house. Eleanor flinched. She glanced at the boy on the couch. He didn't move, didn't look surprised, as if he had been expecting it. Another knock, louder this time. Her breath hitched. Slowly, she stepped toward the door, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She placed her hand on the doorknob, her pulse racing. Just as she was about to turn it, Oliver's voice came from right behind her. "Be careful, Mom. You might not like what you find on the other side." Eleanor hesitated, her fingers gripping the cold doorknob as her mind raced. The rain continued to pour outside, the wind howling through the trees, rattling against the windows. She turned slightly, her eyes locking onto Oliver's. He sat still on the couch, his expression eerily calm, his hands resting in his lap. Another knock. This time it was firmer. Eleanor's pulse pounded in her ears. Who could it be at this hour? No one came to visit her anymore. Not since Oliver disappeared. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and slowly pulled the door open, just enough to see who was on the other side. A man stood on her porch, his face partially obscured by the shadows and the pouring rain. His clothes were soaked, his dark jacket clinging to his frame. He wasn't someone she recognized, but the intensity in his gaze sent a shiver through her. "Mrs. Maxwell," he said, his voice low but firm. "My name is Detective Harrison. I need to speak with you about your son." Her breath caught in her throat. She tightened her grip on the door, glancing back at Oliver, who remained unmoving on the couch. I don't understand," she stammered. The detective's eyes flickered past her, catching a glimpse of the boy inside. His jaw tightened slightly before he met her gaze again. "May I come in?" Eleanor hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to shut the door to protect Oliver, but there was something in Harrison's expression that unsettled her. "What is this about?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. Harrison sighed, shifting slightly under the weight of his wet clothes. "It's about the case, Mrs. Maxwell. About Oliver's disappearance." Her stomach twisted. She had spent 7 years begging the police to keep looking for her son, and now, the night he finally returned, a detective appeared at her doorstep? Something wasn't right. She glanced back at Oliver again, searching his face for any sign of distress, but he simply stared at her with that same unreadable expression. She turned back to the detective. "I think we should talk another time. My son just got home. He needs rest." Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "I understand, but Mrs. Maxwell, the boy in your house, he isn't your son." Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. A cold sweat broke out across her skin. Her grip on the doorknob tightened. "That's impossible," she whispered. Harrison took a slow step forward. "Please, let me explain." Eleanor shook her head, stepping back into the house and closing the door in his face. She locked it quickly, her fingers trembling. She turned to Oliver, her breath shallow. The boy hadn't moved. "What did he mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Oliver tilted his head slightly as if considering her question. "Mom," he said slowly, "do you trust me?" Her stomach nodded. "Of course I do." "Then don't open the door again." A chill ran down her spine. The way he said it, the certainty in his voice, it was as if he already knew what Harrison would say. The detective knocked again, harder this time. "Mrs. Maxwell, please, you're in danger." Eleanor clenched her fists. None of this made sense. Her son had returned. He was standing right in front of her. Wasn't he? She stepped closer to him, her voice shaking. "Oliver, tell me the truth. What happened to you?" He smiled, but it wasn't the warm, innocent smile she remembered. It was something else entirely. "I came back home, Mom. That's all that matters." She swallowed hard. Outside, the detective's voice was muffled by the storm. But inside, in the suffocating quiet of her home, Eleanor felt the weight of something she couldn't explain. She had prayed for this moment for 7 years, but now, as she looked into the eyes of the boy before her, she wasn't sure if she had welcomed her son home or something else entirely. Eleanor's breath felt trapped in her chest as she stepped backward, her gaze locked onto the boy standing before her. The storm outside raged on, rain hammering against the windows, wind howling through the trees. Detective Harrison's voice continued to filter through the door, insistent, unwavering, but Eleanor couldn't focus on his words. She could only hear the ones Oliver had just spoken. "Don't open the door again." The certainty in his voice unsettled her. It wasn't the plea of a frightened child, nor the demand of someone seeking safety. It was something else, something deeper. as if he knew what was coming next. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling at her sides. She had spent years imagining this moment, longing for it. The day her son would return to her, the day she could finally hold him again and tell him that everything would be okay. But now, standing in the dimly lit living room, with the flickering shadows casting unfamiliar shapes along the walls, she realized something horrifying. This moment was not what she had imagined. Oliver hadn't run to her when he returned. He hadn't cried, hadn't clung to her the way she had always expected. Instead, he had simply appeared, silent and still, waiting for her to find him. He had looked at her with those eyes, eyes she should have recognized, eyes she had memorized every detail of. But tonight, there was something different about them, something distant. Eleanor forced herself to move, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened to you, Oliver?" The boy's head tilted slightly, almost in amusement, almost like he had been waiting for her to ask. "I told you, Mom. I came home." The words hung in the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. A loud bang rattled the door, jolting her back to reality. Harrison's voice was no longer calm. "Mrs. Maxwell, step away from him. You are not safe." Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs. How could this be happening? How could he say that? She turned back to Oliver, searching for something, anything in his face that would tell her what to believe. He was still watching her, his lips curving into a small, almost patient smile. "Mom, do you trust me?" The question was simple, yet it filled her with dread. She had always trusted her son, had fought for him, had searched for him, had prayed for his return every single night. And now he was here. She had gotten everything she wanted, so why did it feel so wrong? Harrison banged on the door again. The locks rattled, but the door held firm. His voice was edged with desperation. "Please, Eleanor, listen to me. The boy in your house is not your son." The storm outside seemed to grow louder, the wind shrieking through the trees. A distant sound, a deep, guttural howl rose in the distance. Eleanor shuddered. She looked back at Oliver. His expression hadn't changed. She forced herself to speak. "Then tell me who you are." The boy's smile widened ever so slightly. "I am Oliver." But the way he said it, the way the words rolled off his tongue, sent ice through her veins. The lights flickered. The wind outside slammed against the house, shaking the walls. Harrison's voice was growing distant, lost beneath the roaring storm. Eleanor took a slow step back, her knees nearly giving out beneath her. "Oliver." She barely recognized her own voice. Oliver blinked at her, his head tilting just slightly. "Do you love me, Mom?" The room felt colder. Eleanor's throat went dry. "Yes." "Then why are you afraid?" A shadow moved in the corner of the room, not from the storm, not from the flickering light, from him. Eleanor's chest tightened. Her entire body screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. A final bang at the door. Then silence. The storm outside suddenly stopped. No wind, no rain, no sound at all. Oliver took a step forward. "Mom," he whispered, "it's just us now." Eleanor's breath caught. The truth settled into her like a weight she could no longer deny. She had prayed for 7 years to have her son back. But sometimes she realized too late, prayers were answered by something else entirely. What would you have done in her place? Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew.